Chapter at the Halsey Institute of Contemporary Art. Tonight's discussion between Renee Stout and Thetyka Robinson is one in a series of In Conversation events that we'll host over the rest of the year for our virtual exhibition, Displacements, Revisitations of Home. Displacements may be experienced at displacements.org. Displacements, Revisitations of Home features the work of 10 artists who were asked to submit work that spoke most closely to their own reflections of the meaning of home. Each artist was paired with a writer who responded to the body of work with an essay. Recordings of all conversation events, including this one, are available at displacements.org after the fact, as well as archived on the Halsey Institute's Facebook page. We invite you to participate in the Displacements project by visiting the Engage tab on the website. There, you'll find a phone number you can call to leave a message sharing your own stories of home, as well as a map where you can leave your home alongside those of others. On the website, you'll also find a resources tab where you can download a teaching packet that you can complete on your own with children or send to an educator you know. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Displacements artist Renee Stout and her partner in conversation, Thetyka Robinson. Thetyka was asked to step in and lead tonight's event after Renee's respondent and our dear friend, Dr. Ade Afuniyan, transitioned to join the ancestors on October 7th. We know Dr. O would be pleased to see these two powerhouse women coming into each other's lives. Renee Stout is an artist who creates work that explores the vestigial retentions of African cultural traditions as manifested in contemporary America. For many years, Renee has used the alter ego Fatima Mayfield, a fictitious herbalist and fortune teller, as a vehicle to role play and confront a variety of personal and social issues. In 1993, Renee became the first American artist to exhibit in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art. She joins us this evening from Washington, D.C. Thetyka Robinson is a modern Renaissance woman who intentionally creates brave spaces for authentic dialogue and creative expression through her work as a skilled facilitator, creative strategist, cultural conversationalist, moderator, and community engagement consultant. She believes the freedom of self comes through the elevation of collective voices through conversation, spiritual connection, and cultural discovery. Thetyka was recently appointed the interim executive director of Enough Pie, a Charleston organization dedicated to using creativity to connect and empower the Charleston Upper Peninsula community. She joins us this evening from here in Charleston, South Carolina. We invite you, the viewers, to leave any questions you have for Renee or Thetyka by entering them in the Facebook comments or by emailing halsey@cfc.edu. Many thanks to both of you, Renee and Thetyka, for giving us this time this evening, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. So, Renee, this is awesome. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to just have this open dialogue with you. I want to just pause and just honor the spirit and the life of Dr. O. I am so honored to be standing in his place in the midst of the conversation he would have been having with you directly. And I find it very, very him for this to be so. And just the conversation of getting to know you and engaging with you and just your work. And I've just been so honored by having the opportunity to get to know you, but also just dig into how your work has this spirit of mysticism and this connection to spirit that is beyond just I feel like almost in a sense, our human eye, that it really causes us to dig deeper. And so I would love if you could just take an opportunity to just tell us about yourself and your work and how you got to where you are right now.
You know, it's hard to explain because I've gone through so many phases and changes to get to where I am right now. But I think what has always remained constant from the time I was a child to right now, a sort of open curiosity about the world that my parents kind of nurtured and fed, even when they didn't understand it, you know, and I think as far as the spiritual part of myself, which is really always expressed in my work, we were speaking the other day when you and I were having our conversation, and I think that what really opened me up was the idea that when I was growing up, my parents did not force me and my sister to go to church, but one had been raised Catholic, one has been raised Baptist, but we went to church with both of those paternal and maternal grandmothers to be exposed to a spiritual belief system. But because I wasn't forced to believe, I didn't feel any guilt about exploring spirituality in general. And so what happened over time, for me, it's not about religion, it's about spirituality. And once you become this spiritual being, the whole world and everything in it is connected. Human beings are connected, you know, like events aren't just these separate events. Everything in the world that goes down connects or affects something else. And so that's the way I've tried to move through life and to view the world around me. And I think that that's how I arrived at where I am now, seeing a connectedness and having a kind of thinking that's very abstract, where I just take in all kinds of information and plug it in to see a bigger picture and process things that are going on socially, culturally, politically, and having it all make sense and dealing with it through the work. Because I feel like as an artist, my responsibility, and I don't know what other artists feel their responsibility is, but mine is leaving a record of the time that I lived in, from the point of view as an African-American woman, and how I viewed the world and how I processed it. And my bodies of work are the evidence of what I've seen and experienced.
So in our previous conversation, where I love how we just jumped right in and it was so authentic. One of the things that I picked up from is that if someone was to view one of your exhibits or just read about your work, if they're not comfortable with exploring spirituality outside of the frame of religion, it makes them nervous, because the way that most individuals were brought up and the way that religion is taught is that there's a hierarchy of a preacher, and then, you know, it's God, it's preacher, you know, and then it's the beings that, you know, the individuals as us who serve. To think outside the box of the fact that we don't have to go through that particular channel, and that we can seek a higher being on our own, or seek our ancestors that's also in the spirit, it seems often foreign and almost mystical and magical, as if you're doing a sin. But in actuality, when it goes back to the root of it, that's where it all started. When we go back to Africa, there's so much there. One of the things you mentioned, and I'd love for you to tie that into how your parents nurtured that openness for you to discover on your own. You also shared that you had the opportunity to be within churches as well. So it's not just you didn't have a framework, but you had the opportunity as a child to be in those places. So there was the dynamic of both spirituality and religion. Can you talk about how you almost like sliding door experiences between the two? How did that shape you, and how did you form that into your current work?
Well, you know, going back to those experiences in going to the churches with my grandmothers, the one church, because it was a Catholic church, was this beautiful building that was grand. It had the niches with the saints, you know, the statues of the saints. It had the racks of candles that you kneel in front of and you light the candles. You know, it had the priest would come out with the incense during the mass and all that. So it was very sensual, and that it appealed to the senses. But the problem with that was that back then, and this was like around in the 60s, early 60s, more like mid 60s, the priest was speaking in Latin to give the mass. And so I had no idea what he was saying. So it's like I couldn't connect in that way, but I did connect visually, like I said, and sensually with that experience. And then in the Baptist church, it was more about the music. And I was turned off by the fire and brimstone of the preacher with the judgment of, that woman with that short skirt and, she's the Jezebel and this and that and the other. It's like that turned me off, but the music was beautiful. So both of those experiences had something beautiful that, I remained connected in that way and internalize those things and still connect on some level with those things. But I think as I was growing up and going to the Saturday art classes at the Carnegie Museum and seeing African art, and then, I kept revisiting that over time. And once I discovered that some of these things were actually spiritual objects and ceremonial objects. And then over the years, reading and peeling, like the peeling of an onion, getting down to the layers of, African spirituality. And as an African-American person, I'm like, well, I'm African-American. If this is African spirituality, why am I not, really looking into this and connecting to this on a deeper level? And that's what I started doing. And once I opened that door, it really started to affect me and my work. And in the strangest way, even though I've never set foot on the African continent, there is a kind of connection that's there through DNA, it's there through spirit, it's there through ancestors. And I think once I started on that trajectory, there was no looking back.
Awesome. And so when you shared how Fatima Mayfield came about and how at that time, can you talk about how she was created and how and why, and then how your transition to now is through you standing in her power?
Well, from the time I was a young girl, I was very shy and introverted, but you don't have the words, people will say, oh, that person is shy. You never heard the word introvert thrown around, until fairly recently, at least. I was always to myself and very creative and doing my thing. And then when I decided that I was going to be an artist, I'm doing my work, I'm in college, and then I get out of college and I'm embarking on a career in art. And then I was asked to do a talk, and I was so upset and so nervous. I just had a fit. I just didn't really want to do it. And my mother said, well, that's part of your job. And so I think, knowing that I should be able to talk about the work, because if people are interested in what you're doing and they want to hear it in your own words, I had to find a way to do that. And it was right around the time also that I had created sort of an alter ego. And I didn't even realize all this while I was doing it. I think subconsciously something told me you have to come outside of yourself. Even if you create a face or a facade that you embody when you have to deal with the public, and then you can retreat to your own space when you're done. So these alter ego, there were two. One was Madame Ching, who was also a fortune teller and a root worker. And then when I got to be about 40, another one emerged, because at 40, women go through a thing. We suddenly shift to another consciousness. So I had to have a new alter ego for that 40-year-old, right? And so that was Fatima Mayfield, and she was really more brazen and bold and that kind of thing. And I realized that the alter ego became a vehicle for me to actually write stories, to tell a narrative, an ongoing story through the work, through this, the series of bodies of work that I was doing. I have an ongoing narrative, and that she is the one that becomes the protagonist in this ongoing narrative. And I realized one day that I had worked through so many issues by dealing with this alter ego that I started to mature into who this woman was, because she was actually somebody that I desired to be, that was really the real me, that I knew the potential me was subconsciously, but I created this person that I could aspire to be and then grew into her.
So I find that, and we talked about this a little bit, but I find that very metaphoric, because as we were sharing that, we find that a lot of Black Americans are, we have fit into this norm of what society says that we are. And we talked about it generationally of how, like, our parents, were told, like, do this and do this, and this will help you succeed in the white man's world or in this particular world and culture. If we speak out too much, we're considered revolutionary. We might lose our jobs. We might lose our establishments and who we are. And so there's a lot of us that it's not foreign for us to put on a mask every day. We might be a certain person in our homes, but when we walk out that door or in conversation, we put on the mask. I feel like a lot of individuals have a Fatima in some way that they really want to come out. Maybe they exercise her in their home because it's free to be open there, but they're not really at a place where they can put her on in the community. Maybe they do that through social media or however, but I would love for you to talk about like, how could one use the power of Fatima to break out and discover who they are outside of the norms and the narratives we were taught to be, and what we really want to be, and that may be hiding behind this narrative of safety, you know, of keeping everything structured within our lives. What would your thoughts or your advice be for someone who desires to break out of this norm? They're about to crack, but they don't know how to be that person. How can they discover their Fatima?
You know, in hindsight, when I think about my own process, I realized that, and see, I could do this, I could speak about it now because I've moved through it and analyzed it and dissected how I got to where I am and why I needed that alter ego and what it did for me. So what I feel like I did was the projecting Fatima was about self-discovery, you know, creating a being and assigning these attributes and this personality to this fictitious person. What I was really doing was saying, this is who I hope I could be. This is who I hope I can grow to be. And I think that each of us knows who we really would hope we could be. You know, if we didn't have societal constraints and familiar constraints and, you know, people projecting things on us, who would we really want to be for ourselves? And that's the process of self-discovery. Who do you want to be? You know, you go inside, and once you do that, you know, then you create that face. That's your face. That's the authentic face. And Fatima, I didn't realize it was the authentic face. So I think that that's what it is. It's a process of self-discovery and deciding for yourself who you want to be and allowing yourself and giving yourself permission to be that. Not society, not your family, giving yourself permission to be the person that you aspire to be.
So you mentioned 40s, that women in their 40s, you know, there's something that pivots in that time frame. Why do you feel it's the 40s for women?
I think there are different ages. I think that 40 is one, and I don't know, maybe I'm, you know, maybe this is the way it happened for me. It doesn't happen for everybody. But I know when I turned 40, it's almost like somebody pulled up a shade and suddenly there was all this light shining in. And, you know, I realized, you know, okay, Fatima said this and that because she was really bold, but no, it wasn't really her saying it, was me saying it. And then with 60, you just don't give a damn. You know, it's just like I'm to the point where I'm going to say whatever I'm going to say. And if that hurts your feelings, oh, well, you know, you'll get over it. So those are the two periods for me. It was 40 and 60.
Gotcha. Do you still, do you find that there's another character that could be coming out of the evolution of you coming into your 60s, or do you feel like you are Renee? Renee is it. I am present. I am here. This is me. There are no other characters.
This is Renee. This is it. And then now Renee just grows, you know, and surprises herself. And I have this reoccurring dream. I haven't had it in a while, probably because I haven't needed it in a while, but when I need it again, it may come. But I had this recurring dream that I've had since my 30s. And I dreamed that I encountered this big house, and I just purchased this house. And sometimes I'm walking through it by myself. Sometimes I'm with probably the real estate agent or somebody like that. But I'm walking through the house, and I think I've been through several times already. But then all of a sudden I'll get to a door that I've never seen before. And when I open up the door, there are like 4 or 5 more rooms that I didn't know existed. And I always wondered what that dream meant. And then I realized that the house was a metaphor for the self. And that even though the house was in somewhat disrepair, it wasn't perfect. And when I find the new rooms, it's like me moving to a new level of self-awareness when you discover 5 or 6 more rooms you didn't know you had. You know, I didn't even know I had it in me to be this, and you move up to another level. So I haven't had that in a while, but you know, maybe what's going to happen is another character won't come. I'll just have the dream again.
I love it. So you know, you and I talked about how within the African culture and the diaspora itself, that there is the awareness, or just whether we talk about it or not, there's this, that we do know some mysticism of that nature has been within the African culture. We fast forward to where we are now, or how, you know, over time you get over to the Western world and how things are. There's always this, I shared with you how my grandmother, when I was younger, you know, something would happen or go missing in her home, and my mom and her siblings would be like, oh, she's going to the root doctor, or she's gonna go, you know, just, and then everybody would be nervous, but she would get her answer as who took something or did something. And so and it became almost like either something you feared or something you made joke of, but I don't know if people actually accepted it. When we look at your work, you speak of hoodoo. And so a lot of people know of voodoo, but they don't really understand the culture of hoodoo. When I looked it up, voodoo is the religion, hoodoo is the magic that comes of it. So can you talk about that as far as for in the African culture, why and what led you to the voodoo that directed you to talk about specifically the hoodoo, for those that find that to be, they fear it. So they do everything to reverse it and try to remove it and not be open to it. Can you talk to us about it in this space where, you know, we hope that people would be open to hearing and learning more about it?
You know, I don't know if I'll be able to say anything that's going to make certain people not be fearful. You know what I mean? Because in this society that has decided that the official religion is Christianity, even though we know it's not the official religion, and people are fearful of being judged because they might look into other belief systems. But I think for me, one of the reasons why I started looking at something like hoodoo and voodoo and certain things like that is because those hierarchies that you talked about within religion earlier in our conversation, in a sense, in these spiritual belief systems, you can cut out the middleman. There's nobody that has to be the go-between in some way between you directly petitioning, you know, the spirits, the universe, or God, or however you want to define, you know, the overall spirit. It's like the individual is empowered to have a direct connection in a conversation. And that's what I was drawn to, you know, that direct connection, one-on-one, where I don't have to leave my house and go to a church for somebody to tell me, you know, that, oh, you're communicating with spirit now. I can do it right here. You know, I can do it walking down the street, you know. And like I was telling you in our conversation, another conversation, that ever since I opened up that door on African spirituality, I feel like ancestors are always around me, you know, and that is my faith. My faith is that I'm being protected by ancestors. And that's the way, you know, that I move through life. That's the way I function in my studio, as if I have an audience there in back of me watching everything that I'm doing, coaching me, you know, telling me, you know, inspiring me. And, you know, just to take this time to segue back into the show Displacements, as an African-American woman, I have never totally felt at home in every sense in this country, even though it's my country. I was born here. My parents were born here. My grandparents were born here, on back to slavery, but I have never felt like I've been accepted like this is totally mine. So there's this kind of strange way you have of moving about through this. And home is home. Home, I always felt, was where my mother is. But my mother has since left Pittsburgh, where I was raised, and she lives in Stockton with my sister. So I don't have family home to go back to. So that's gone. I feel like I've been displaced with that family home that I grew up in. So what starts to happen is home becomes the place where I feel like I'm comfortable with the ancestors taking care of me. So as I move about, I'm home with the ancestors. So that's why I think that that's been important to me, this kind of spiritual belief system that makes me feel like I don't need the middleman to tell me that I'm safe or I'm taken care of. I don't know if that makes sense to people, but that's the way it makes sense to me.
No, I'm glad you said that, because I was going to pivot that to, I think for a lot of African Americans or Black Americans, period, there's this feeling of, in the midst of this energy that's in the air, and it's been there for a while. I feel like our ancestors are calling us in, calling us to awaken, calling us to rise. But I think that people get confused because they don't, and we talked about this, when you do remove, I think that's the safety you find within religion, is that there's someone to help guide. But when you don't have that person, you don't know how to get home. You don't know how, there's a lot of questions of, how do I do this? How do I go home? How do I discover who I am? And so people do, their ancestry tree and their trails and go back to like, who am I, and their roots, and try to discover. And I think that's why there's such a high rise in Black Americans trying to go back to Africa, just to be on the soil, to try to identify with, who am I outside of this religion or this world that, brought my people here? Who am I? And so there is a sense of displacement, I believe, in a lot of individuals. I believe there's this desire to, who am I outside of all this stuff, right? This math,
yes.
I've been taught a lot, I've been socialized into a lot, but who am I? So if we talk about some of your work specifically, one of the pieces that I told you about that really touched me was the one where you have the heart in the glass. And I don't, but specifically you have some other ones here that you've chosen to share. And I'd love for you to go through them and just tell us a little bit about. So the piece is at the top to the left. Can you talk about that piece? Like, what is in the bowl?
Oh yeah, this is the perfect one. And the reason why is because this is actually the oldest piece. Most of the pieces are pretty recent. This piece is from the early 2000s, I think. And it's called Slow Voyage from the Land of Cosmic Slop. And, I love George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic, and because the message in the music to me was so important, and music has always been important to my creative process. And also, as a young person, coming of age in the late 60s, early 70s, that's who I was listening to, in the 70s, listening to, Parliament and Funkadelic, and becoming socially and politically aware of what was going on around me. And the reason why I called that this piece, Slow Voyage from the Land of Cosmic Slop, I feel like as African Americans, we've on, from the Middle Passage on up till now, it's like being on a journey in a boat. We're trying to get someplace. We haven't gotten there yet, right? In this particular piece, it's feeling like we're in a boat, but the boat's not moving. It's on a dry dock. We're stuck, and that there's a brain in the middle. That's a brain that I, fashioned out of Sculpey clay. And there's also, you can see this like water is in the boat. The water's not supposed to be in the boat, right? The water's supposed to be transporting you to someplace, but we're stuck on the dry dock with the water in the boat. And you can't see it from here, but there are flies and insects embedded all in the quote water, right? Like it's stagnant. And to me, that was a metaphor that I was thinking about how hard it is for us to move forward. We're always fighting. And when I made this, we weren't even in the times we are right now. But now that I look at this piece and revisit it, especially, this is why I included it in this exhibition. Why are we moving backwards? You know what I mean? Why are we back where we were in the 1960s, still dealing with the same thing? So when I made this, it wasn't even as bad as it is now, right? But yet I could feel it. And I do what I'm, compelled to do. But this piece, even though I did it, it was seeing something coming, and here we are.
So one of the things we talked about, and if it's more identifiable to do one of your other pieces, but we talked about how people are, and this makes me think of this when I look at that, but I'm sure there's other pieces that could also do that. But we talked about the reality that we are still asking for permission.
Yes.
So we're still asking for permission to be. And so I feel like in that piece that you just talked about, I think that's one of the reasons why we continue to get stuck, is because if you think about when you were a child, you could not act on something until you got permission, which was a green light or a yes or a no from your parents or whoever that adult figure was in your life. So it was, can I do this? May I do this? And you remain there until you got permission to do something. Yes. Well, if we fast forward that to right now, we shared how there's still a lot of people who are not standing in their Fatimas. They're not standing in their power, in a sense, to say, you don't have to ask for permission to be yourself. You don't have to ask for permission to be present. You can still do. You don't have to ask for permission. So I'd love to talk about that and how your work reflects that it's not about, you're not standing still, that you are expressing through your work that you have the ability to be free. You have the ability to be without asking permission.
Perfect.
And I think that's what,
go ahead.
That's what when you talked about like what your parents gave you,
yeah,
they didn't give permission. They didn't give you permission. Well, they gave you permission to think outside of what society was trying to say you had to be. And I think that's amazing.
It is amazing. And I thank them for that. I told them, I said, I asked them once, why didn't you force, me and my sister? I only have one sibling, and it's, my sister. And they're like, religion is something that we felt we were forced into, that we shouldn't have been forced into, and that when you were an adult, you'd figure out what you wanted. Now, they talked about God, they talked about right and wrong, and they gave the clear message that they thought there was a higher power, but they didn't define it for us in a way that we were locked into a way of thinking about that. And I think that has made me even a more spiritual person, because I feel like if they had forced me into something, I'd be rejecting it. The type of personality I've had, I'm like, no, you're not going to force it. I don't want to deal with any of it, But because they gave me the freedom to search, that, I found something or a way of existing or a way of being that was perfect for me. And I think that was the gift that they gave me to be myself. And this one image right here over on the right with the character Fatima standing, it's a black and white photograph, and she's in a space that I've created for Fatima in my house. She's in her thinking room where she, keeps notes on what she's talked about with her clients and what she has advised them to do. This image is called Listening to the Voice of a Spirit. So basically, if you look off to the side, you see on a shelf, there are several carved African ceremonial figures off to the side. And it's like one of the mouths are open on it. So it's almost like she stopped for a moment in that room to just listen to a voice of the spirit advise her on something. And so that's the way that I feel like I move through life, by asking the universe's permission, but not anybody on this earth, because when I'm looking at what's going on right now, socially, politically, it is amazing to me that there are these people who call themselves our authorities, yet they are acting out badly and childishly and criminally, and they're our authorities. And so I'm like, no, you're not my authorities. I've decided that I don't have to ask your permission. You don't even know what you're doing. So I'm not asking your permission to do anything, especially not to be. So that's where I am right now. I mean, that's just, she's talking to the spirits let her know what to do.
When we come back out, Katie, if you come back out a little bit, can you tell us about the radios? The sound, the collage that you have of the clocks of the radios, the old school.
Yeah, this piece is actually not even, they're not even assembled radios. They've all been constructed to look like radios. And it's called Lay Your Hand on the Radio. And the reason why I got that title is I remember growing up and my grandmother would be in the kitchen on Sundays. She might be, doing the prep work for dinner and cooking lunch at the same time. And she'd listen to one of the church sermons being broadcast. We had this intercom system in the house, and it had a radio in it, and she would turn the radio on. And so she'd be listening to the service. And, so she's listening to the Baptist church. And so sometime you'd hear the preacher say, and if you are ill and infirmed and you can't be with us today, we want you to lay your hand on the radio, right? And so that always stuck with me, right? That he wanted you to lay your hand on the radio so you could feel the vibrations, right? So on these radios, within the dial where the frequency numbers are, I actually painted words like empathy, humility, humanity, love, compassion, things that we need to be able to tune back into to have a civil society. And it was a reaction to where I saw where, you know, this culture headed. Now, the funny thing is, I created this piece in 2014, 15. This was before, you know, the 2016 election. But back then, even, I knew we were at a crossroads, and I knew society was about to suffer in a way we'd never seen before. And I don't even know how I felt that, you know, but I felt compelled to make this piece because I felt that these were all concepts that we were moving away from. You know, how do you not feel empathy? How do you see children in cages and not feel their parents somewhere wondering if they'll ever see their child again? How do you not connect? You know, one of the main ones has humanity in it. How do you not connect to other people's humanity? So that's what this piece was actually about. You know, these concepts that you need to hold a society together that we're allowing to slip away until we're getting to a point where we are now.
How do you feel at a time such as now where we're split as a society, as a world, as a country? How do we get back to our dial, our center compass, to where we can find ourselves within the middle one that you said that you put the specific, the empathy, the love, all those particular things. How does one get back to that through getting back to home? I almost see that as like a compass, like someplace you come back to when you've lost everything, when you've been out there and now you're home. You're home, but spiritually is where you're telling us home is, like here. How do we get back there in the midst of all of that?
You know, it's funny because I have two ways of looking at it. It could go, as far as I'm concerned, it seems like it could go two ways. One is that the people who have had the entitlement to have things their way all this time, they're acting out now because they see it as their last stand to have things the way they want it. And everybody is sort of questioning everything right now and asserting their right to be. And so that's why we see all the turmoil right now. And one of the things that makes me hopeful is that young people, I don't think ever want to go back to a time like, you know, what it was in the 50s, and that they are going to be the resistance. I don't know if my generation has enough juice to still fight, but I know that, you know, young people have connected. The world has gotten smaller, you know, for them through, like, you know, social media, the internet, and that kind of thing. They may feel more connected to the world in a way that is not going to let them succumb to that kind of tribal way of thinking where they're just limited to their little neighborhood and that kind of thing. And hopefully young people will be our hope. I don't know. The other way I see it going is 50%. It seems to me like, okay, maybe about a third of the country voted for Trump in 2016, and now there are even more this time around, even with all that he's done. And to me, that shows me that we're a country that's so divided that I don't know if we can get to a point where there's going to be compromises between those two diametrically opposed or you know, ways of thinking, that I almost can see the country having to divide. It's too big. And these two ideologies can't coexist anymore. And there's no reason to believe that it can't divide, just like North and South Korea, you know, or East and West Germany way back, that it may have to come to that before it can come together again, like East and West Germany did, you know, because you cannot have a group of people deciding that, well, you're not thinking the way we want you to think, so we're going to have our guns and we're going to threaten you into thinking the way we want you to think. How's that going to work? So either you divide it and let these people go on and live the way they want to live, and then more progressive people decide they want to create a better world and we move on and do what we need to do, or you divide it. And or the kids, you know, start to rise up. A younger generation takes the reins politically and starts to move us in another direction. So I don't know. I don't know how it's going to come out. I really don't.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. I hope that those that are listening and do have the opportunity to watch this later, and also have the opportunity to really experience your exhibit, hopefully in person again, but if not virtually, really do find their compass and really do take the time to be silent, be still, find their strength in self, and really embracing their spiritual connection to our ancestors, to a greater thing that's greater than us. And not meaning that you have to drop the religion that you believe in, but that that just knowing that you have that. So Katie, I wanted to go back to, just because I want to symbolize this, the room, the red room. So can you just talk about this? Because one thing I do find that, and I'm seeing more, is that more Black Americans, that I find that when I go into their homes, there's a more conscious effort to put up pictures, symbolization of who they are, going back to their roots. Can you talk about this room? When I think about it, I think about this room of all the things that symbolize what that may mean. Can you share what you were thinking when you created this?
Yeah, definitely. This is okay. That image that I showed you of Fatima listening to the voice of a spirit when she was in that room. Well, actually, if I had panned out in that photograph, you know, it's an environment, and it used to look like this, only the walls are blue. And this was actually an installation that I did at the Reginald Lewis Museum in Baltimore. But this time around, I decided to create red walls. I just felt like I wanted these bright red walls instead of the blue ones where the installation actually existed, you know, in my home. And one of the things that I was thinking about is, you know, as an African-American woman, you know, we come from modest, you know, at least I came from modest beginnings. You didn't have people do ancestral portraits, right? You couldn't afford that. And so when you go into people's homes sometimes, or you look through Architectural Digest, and you see these homes, sometimes they have ancestral portraits and that kind of thing. And I'm like, well, you know, I may not have ancestral portraits, but as a painter, I can paint my own. So I painted a picture of my paternal grandmother. And then this is my paternal grandfather's stepfather over here. So, you know, I created this, you know, I make everything in this environment. It's like all the paintings, you know, are done by me. The masks are African masks, but, you know, I did the paintings. You know, even the pillows on the sofa, the little settee, I made those. And so it's back once again to the idea of not having my home to go back to, but creating these little tableaus that evoke home and the way my mother and my grandmother like to decorate. So in some ways I'm paying homage to them by decorating spaces and, you know, just getting that bit of home, trying to step into their shoes and carry on traditions. So, you know, in feeling displaced from home, I create these little bits of home and, you know, and act out what it is to create a home. So that's what this piece was about.
So I think we're about to get ready to take some questions. So if I could ask you just one more question before we shift there. We talk a lot about displacement. We know that the exhibit itself and the reminder of going back, reminding for displacement and finding home and all of that. So if someone had none of that, but they saw this, or after this conversation, they're saying, I want to find home. I want to create that even within my home. What advice would you give them of where to start from to begin their walls and their pieces, you know, the way you've brought pieces of your family to you to create home in this space? What advice would you give someone to start from scratch to create a home within their home of where their ancestors and spirit can connect and be welcome?
To me, it's like what they could do, like I did with a room, taking a room, you know, because most of the house functions as a studio. It's all workspace, you know. But this, you know, this room in my house is sort of the room where it's the guest room, and I happen to be sleeping there right now. But it's like a cocoon, and it's the room, I call it the thinking room, because I can go there and feel like I'm in this cocoon. There are books all in there that I can sit and read. It's just a really comforting space. And I think what people can do is imagine home and try to recreate it, even if it's a couple of objects that remind you, even if they're not the exact objects that your relatives had or your mother had. If you can find something that simulates that particular object and reminds you of, you know, a loved one or a family member, you know, go find these things, whether you find it in the Goodwill or wherever you find it, and gather these things around you and first make a tableau or create a room in your house. Like I found a salt shaker that we used to have the same one on our table, our kitchen table. The whole time I was growing up, this salt shaker was there. And it's not even a really nice salt shaker, but I happened to find it in the Goodwill. And I bought it because it reminded me of whenever we'd sit down to dinner, there was this salt shaker that was always there. Well, I have it in my kitchen. And when I look over at it, that one little object just evokes home and a whole lot of memories. So it can be done through like a few objects or creating, one room environment or something like that.
Awesome. So I think the biggest takeaway that I get from this is that, and I hope others do too, is that when, if you desire to want to seek what is home to you and you feel displaced from this place we call America, that is our home, that you can go to Africa, you can go back home, but you also can create home within your space. And by identifying those things that connect you to home, that is the spiritual part of what you're talking about. That is the spiritual relationship, the connection. What you just said, there's something spiritual that connects you to that particular thing that reminds you of home. It reminds you of family and all that. So you don't have to fear the spiritual realm in a sense that's outside of what you can't necessarily find in your religion as far as for your faith, but you can also find it in discovery. And that's what spiritual is all about. That spiritual connection is removing the limitations so that you can be present to experience all things and then go back home and find it with you at all times.
Exactly.
So, Katie, I think we're ready for questions.
Yes, and thank you so much, Renee and Thetyka. You've given us all a lot to think about our homes and how we exist in this place that we may or may not call home. So thank you so much for that. If you do have any questions, please be sure to leave them in the Facebook comments, or you can email halsey@cfc.edu. My first question is for you, Renee. Just thinking about, you touched on this a little bit when you and Thetyka were discussing the work in the exhibition. But for this show, for Displacements, we asked you to send work that evoked home or explored home for you, and we touched on a few of the pieces that look at this concept maybe more literally or not. And I'm wondering how you approached selecting all of the work for the show, or what was the first piece, or what was the kind of domino that led you to select the pieces that you did?
It's interesting because it was the first one we talked about with the boat, just how my ancestors got to this hemisphere. And I think if you go look at all the pieces, each one I can attach a family member to it. A family member was the impetus to create that piece. And so in some weird way, all the pieces that I gave you, evoked like my paternal grandmother, my mother, my father, my grandfather. So I kind of assembled family members through the pieces that I chose. And then also my own home that I've created the best I could, yeah.
No, I think that's really beautiful. And thinking about family, the arms of family members being the truest home that we ever know. So I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, so, you selected this work, and the process for the exhibition was you sent us the work and we shared it with your assigned respondent, who was Dr. O, and Dr. O wrote an essay in response that is, I hear his voice when reading it. It's just him, every word. And I'm wondering, did you see anything new in your work through Dr. O's words?
No, I didn't see anything new. And that's the only reason why is because O and I were already connected in a spiritual way, that when I had my show at the Halsey, we had connected. And you know how when you connect with somebody and you don't even have to have words because you already know that they understand you on every level. So when he wrote, he basically was writing basically what I was feeling about the work. He picked up on that, and there didn't have to be anything new. He knew what was there. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that, and he brings in music too. So when you first started bringing up music and its influence, I thought, oh yeah, I that came out in reading Dr. O's response as well.
Right. Because the one piece that that's in the exhibition, it looks like a record player. My maternal grandfather was a blues musician. He played blues with people in the community and that kind of thing. So of course you have my John the Conqueror root, which is a powerful root in African American lore, and one of the most powerful roots. And then inside that, where you see there's a little magnifying glass, there's an actual piece of high John the Conqueror root that's powering the thing, and not electricity. The power is being driven by, those African traditions and the African American traditions. And this was not a record player that I found. This is actually constructed. Like the arm is actually a chopstick from a restaurant. The arm of the needle is.
No, I think that's so fascinating, especially for viewers to know that a lot of these objects aren't necessarily found, that you fabricate them.
Exactly.
Play in your piece. So I think that's really great.
Yeah.
We have a question from Facebook that a viewer wants to know, how do Fatima and your ancestors differ?
The only way that I could say that they differ is that, okay, if we're talking about, when I think ancestors, I'm talking about African ancestors that may have made the journey through the Middle Passage, as well as the ones who've never set foot on Africa, but were slaves here, on up until, a generation before me, where people have passed on. They're all ancestors. And I think that what differs in Fatima is Fatima's a living woman. And so these ancestors are her ancestors as well. So in some ways, I created the conduit that was able to communicate with the ancestors better than I could. And now that I'm ready to, I don't really need her as much anymore. So that's the only way she differs, is that she's a live woman.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have a second question from a viewer. It says, at the beginning of the talk, I remember Renee saying something about vestigial connections. Would you consider speaking to that a little more in the context of your work? Amber, I think that was me. I said,
it was you. It was you.
it was me, that Renee's work explores the vestigial retentions of African cultural traditions. Could you speak a little to that, Renee?
Yeah, and it goes back to also what Thetyka was saying about her grandmother going to the root worker, even though her grandmother is a Christian woman. There is something about African spiritual belief systems that sort of stayed with our ancestors and our grandparents, that even when they didn't consciously know why they were doing certain things, there was that connection. And so it's hard to explain, but it's this thing where deep in your soul, you're connected to this well of humanity where your ancestors dwell. And you act in ways that you have that connection. Even though you can't explain it, sometimes you don't know you're consciously doing it. So I don't even think that I could put it into words. I can't articulate it. It's just a way that you move about to know that you're connected, where these vestigial, the word, where they're coming through, and you know it. You know it. Sometimes you consciously know it. Sometimes you intuitively know it. But you know it on a certain, on various levels. And it comes through in my work. I think personally, I see these things happen in my work. I get in my studio, I get in a zone, I'm creating, I'm opening myself up. I have an idea that I'm trying to create, and consciously I know what I want to make. But what I realize after I'm done, that when I'm creating, there's some subconscious things that are being fed into the work. And it's only after I stop for the day and look at it that I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't know that, I was operating on that level. How did this happen? So I think, working in that studio is when those things come out.
Thank you. And bringing in, Thetyka, talking about some of your personal experiences growing up as well, and thinking about this project and your now relationship with Renee, what was it like coming to know Renee through this project specifically? And in doing so, have you reconsidered what home means to you, through these connections?
First of all, I have to say that I remember seeing Renee's exhibit and her exhibition, and I remember there was a shift in me when I walked through, and I was like, "Whoa, okay," and I shared this with her, that there was this feeling of acknowledging something is shifting in me while I'm walking through this, and I can either choose to fear it and walk back out and say, okay, there's something wrong with that exhibit and project it off on the exhibit, or I can walk through it and continue to embrace it and say, okay, there's something that's shifting in me and I need to ask myself why, and I need to sit with it and not fear it, but acknowledge it. And so I will say that the interesting thing with meeting and talking to Renee was that it was nice to put a person who's so down to earth, who's open, who is a real live Fatima, who is very comfortable in her skin, it was just really nice because the way that I have embraced myself as I've gotten older, and Fatima, the reason why, I mean, look at me saying Fatima, Renee, the reason why I asked you about the 40s is because I'm in my 40s, and I find that that's where my inner Fatima has come out too, where I have stood in who I am and not apologizing for that. And even if that meant that I had to lose some people who were dear to me, or that they didn't understand the journey that I was going on, I couldn't allow that to shift what my goal was and where my ancestors were leading me and where my spiritual inside compass was leading me. I didn't lose God. I didn't lose all those things that raised me and I was rooted in as I was growing up. Those things came along too. So I made space for that, and I made space for the new, and it's actually expanded the way I show up in the world. When it comes to home, as you can see on my wall, art is something that's a huge expression of who I am. My home is like an exhibit. It's my own personal journey exhibit. I have pieces from different parts of my life that are all over my home. I also bring nature into my home. I have over 20-something plants in my home, and those things are a part of who I am. And I've stood very, I stand very proud in that. I feel like my ancestors are with me. I feel like I'm never alone spiritually. I feel like when I go to meditate, when I go to pray, journal, I'm never alone. I feel like I always have what I need. And if I seek something and I need something, it's going to come. So that connected to meeting Renee was like as I told her, and we even both said it, like, we're going to talk ourselves out of this, and we're not going to leave room for the discovery that's going to happen in the conversation. So it was like being at home with someone who I was supposed to cross paths with. That's why I find it very intentional. I believe that it's nothing but Dr. O. It's so him that he would say, it's time for me to ascend and go to be with the ancestors that I've been telling you all about. And I'm going to leave you with these two beautiful women who are, and that not necessarily by physical, I mean by spirit, that are going to share with you and guide you through. And I feel like his energy is here in this space. So yes, that's what meeting Renee has done to me. It's kind of like layered on some beautifulness of like, this is awesome to me. Is very honest in who they are and not going to apologize for the freedom they were given at such a young age.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I mean, just speaking for myself, I'm sure I speak for other viewers, that it's been really beautiful and rewarding to even just get to witness, your what feels like an old friendship, and I'm sure is and will grow as we move forward.
Mm-hmm.
I have one last question from a viewer that I'd like to ask before we close the event. And question is for you, Renee. And he says, I wonder what Renee would say about the relationship between art making practice and conjuring. Can you speak to that?
For me, it's the same thing because sometimes conjuring's going on while I'm making the artwork. There have been times where I've created an artwork and inserted certain things into it because I'm conjuring while I'm making the artwork. And no, the viewer doesn't know that. I know it, So to me, there's really not a line between those two things.
Thank you.
I just wanted to share that and also in the previous conversation that Renee and I had, one of the things we talked about and she shared was that how the younger generation is they're standing in a lot of wisdom because they are standing in that I want to seek, I want to find, I have the power to discover, to move mountains, to not have to wait for someone to give me permission. And I just want to make sure that if there is someone who's listening that is young, that is in this space of like trying to create change, working in that space, to know that you're not alone. The ancestors are with you and continue to push on. Your wisdom is not about the age that you are. The wisdom is about what you seek to find in your journey and what you take with you along the way. So I just wanted to put that out there, that I think that is such a powerful nugget that your parents gave you. And I think that's such a powerful statement that you shared, Renee, and that the younger generation is becoming the teachers for
It's their
even the
time
older.
now. It's getting to be their time now. It really is. And they need to step up. If they can step up, step up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you. What an important message for you to leave with us. And thank you for sharing that with our viewers and beyond, as I know you both do in your lives and in your work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Oh, our pleasure. And thank you all of the viewers for joining us.
Thank you, viewers.
Thank you so much. But again, I want to remind the viewers that this evening's talk between Renee Stout and Thetyka Robinson is one in a series of conversations that will take place over the remainder of 2020. We've been having a lot of these conversations. They're so fascinating. Each one is so different. And I've learned so much over the course of the exhibition. So I hope you'll all join us on our next conversation. Will be Thursday, December 3rd at 7 p.m. here on Facebook Live, which is a conversation between artist Hung Liu and me, Katie Hirsch.
Yeah.
And for our Halsey Institute members, please be sure to join us on Tuesday, December 1st for a virtual curator-led tour of the Displacements exhibition. Learn how to become a member at halsey.cfc.edu so you can join in on great behind-the-scenes events like that. In the meantime, please visit displacements.org to experience the exhibition and put these events on your calendar. Thank you, thank you, thank you again, Renee and Thetyka, for your time tonight.
Thank you, Katie and Thetyka.
Thank you. Definitely. Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Katie. Have a good evening.
Bye, everyone.